My name is Renee Calloway. I was 36 years old when I pushed open an unlatched door 40 minutes before my own wedding ceremony and found my best friend of 14 years with her hand on my groom's bare chest. He still had his boutonniere on the floor. She still had my trust. What neither of them knew was that I had already made 2 phone calls, written 3 things on the back of a ceremony program, and walked to a microphone in front of 120 people, all before either of them could decide what their next lie was going to be. They thought they knew who I was, a woman too grateful, too steady, too in love to do anything but cry. They had no idea what I was about to become. Let me tell you how I got here. Before we dive in, comment where you're watching from today. And if stories like this speak to you, hit subscribe because tomorrow's story is even more intense. 3 months out, I can tell you exactly what the light looked like. It came through the bedroom window at a low October angle, the kind that turns everything amber and soft, and I was standing in front of the mirror on Greenfield Avenue, pinning my grandmother's brooch to the neckline of my gown. Small gold oval, a cluster of seed pearls at the center. My hands were steady. My coffee was still warm on the dresser. I remember thinking the morning felt like a reward. I was still a fool then, but I was a well-dressed one. Let me back up. I'm telling you this from the other side of it, 3 months past the worst day and the best decision of my life, from a place where I can look at what happened clearly and without flinching. My name is Renee Calloway. I'm 36 years old. I manage regional sales for a commercial flooring company, 4 territories, a team of 11, a track record I built without anyone handing me a single door. I am the woman people call when things need to get done quietly and correctly. I have always been that woman. That steadiness is real. It is also, I understand now, exactly what certain people decided to use. I am not a pushover. I want you to understand that before anything else. But I do love hard. My mother's voice saying, "Renee, you love people with your whole wallet," lives in my memory clear as a bell, because she wasn't wrong. I paid off Deshaun's car loan 8 months into our relationship. Didn't announce it, didn't frame it, didn't file it away as leverage. He had the debt, I had the means, and I loved him. That was the whole equation. We were going to build a life together. What was the point of starting it with that hanging over us? That was the kind of woman I was. Deshaun Price, my fiancé, 39 years old, assistant principal at a middle school across town, was the kind of man who made a room like him. He had this laugh that loosened people up, this way of making whoever he was talking to feel like the most interesting person in the space. Parents loved him. Teachers respected him. He coached the debate team as a volunteer and showed up to every community event with a handshake and a smile. In public, he was magnetic. In private, he had a way of making you feel like you disappointed him without ever telling you how. A silence that lasted a beat too long. A comment tucked inside a compliment. Nothing you could hold up and say, "Look at this." Just a low-grade friction that you learned to work around. I worked around it. I told myself it was stress. He had a demanding job. So did I. My mother used to pin my grandmother's brooch to my church dress when I was 9 years old, just for special Sundays. She'd smooth the fabric around it and say, "This goes to the woman in this family who loves the hardest." I'd worn it that morning without thinking twice about what I was doing. Some things you carry because they feel right. You don't question the weight. Now, Tanya. You need to know about Tanya Odom, my best friend of 14 years, because she is half of this story. 37, event planner, the kind of beautiful that she wore lightly and weaponized carefully. We had been through everything together. Her mother's illness, my promotions, 2 apartments, 3 cities, more late dinners than I can count. When I think about who I trusted without condition, without audit, without a second thought, it was her. She had offered to coordinate the venue decor for the wedding as her gift to me, insisted on it actually, said it was what she wanted to give us. And 8 weeks before the wedding, she'd suggested the private bridal suite on the 2nd floor of the venue, separate from the main getting-ready room, quieter, away from the bustle of 120 guests arriving. "You'll want somewhere to breathe before the ceremony," she'd said. "Somewhere just for you." I'd thought it was thoughtful. I'd thought a lot of things. Looking back, I can see the signs I filed away and didn't act on. Tanya had been strange for months, distracted in our phone calls, sharper than usual when we were in person, quick to change subjects that touched on the wedding details. I'd chalked it up to her being overextended with her own clients. She was busy. We were both busy. Deshaun had started sleeping with his phone face down on the nightstand sometime in the spring, and when I'd mentioned it once, lightly, he'd said the screen brightness was bothering him at night. I had a seating chart to finish and a catering timeline to confirm. I did not have room to chase shadows. So I didn't. That morning, I stood at the mirror on Greenfield Avenue, and I looked at myself. Brooch pinned straight, gown pressed clean, coffee warm on the dresser, and I believed I was walking into the best day of my life. I picked up my bouquet. I walked out the door. The venue was a restored event hall on the east side, exposed brick, tall windows, a grand staircase in the lobby that Tanya had dressed with white hydrangeas and gold ribbon. It looked exactly like what it was supposed to look like. Beautiful, intentional, planned by someone who knew what she was doing. I arrived at 9:15. My maid of honor, my cousin Bria, who had driven 4 hours from Memphis and cried twice already before noon, was immediately absorbed into the organized chaos of florists, caterers, and a wedding coordinator who communicated exclusively through a headset and a clipboard. The main getting ready room buzzed with bridesmaids and hairspray, and someone's aunt who had arrived 40 minutes early and needed a chair. I moved through all of it with my checklist in my head and my bouquet in my hands, steady as I always was, doing what I always did. 40 minutes before the ceremony, Bria went downstairs to manage the flower girls. I was alone. The bridal holding room was quiet, a small anteroom just off the main hall, furnished with a settee, a standing mirror, and a table with water and a single white rose in a bud vase. Someone had thought of everything. I sat for a moment, smoothed the front of my gown, and reached up to touch the brooch at my neckline. My hand found fabric. Just fabric. I had pinned it to my gown that morning at the apartment. I was certain of it. I could still feel the small pressure of setting the clasp. But I'd taken the gown off briefly when I arrived, to touch up the bustle, and I had laid it across the vanity chair in the suite upstairs while Tanya and I finished getting ready. I must have transferred the gown without checking. The brooch was still up there. You know that feeling when something small goes wrong and your brain does a quick calculation? How much does this matter? How much time do I have? I had 40 minutes. The suite was 1 floor up. The main staircase would take me straight through the lobby where guests were already arriving, and I was not walking through a crowd of 120 people in my wedding gown looking for a piece of jewelry. There was a back hallway staircase, a service route that Tanya had pointed out to me that morning. Quiet, direct. I took it. The second floor was still. The hallway ran the length of the building, a long stretch of pale carpet and sconce lighting, and the suite was at the far end. I could hear the muffled sounds of the reception level below, chairs scraping, someone's microphone feedback, the low, warm noise of a gathering. The suite door was not fully latched, not open, not closed, just resting against the frame, the latch tongue not caught, a thin line of shadow where the door met the jamb. I registered it for half a second before I pushed it open. I don't know exactly what I expected to find. Not this. Never this. Deshaun stood near the vanity. His suit jacket was folded over the back of the chair, neat, like he'd placed it there carefully. His dress shirt was open, not loosened at the collar, open. Every button undone, the fabric fallen off his shoulders. And Tanya stood beside him, her bridesmaid dress twisted at the waist, one strap slipped, her hand flat against the center of his chest. They had not heard the door. My hands went still at my sides. I stood there, and I took it in the way your brain takes in something it doesn't want to process, detail by detail, like a list. 2 champagne flutes on the vanity, one tipped on its side. His boutonniere on the floor, the white rose stem bent. Tanya's updo coming loose at the back, 2 pins gone, a section of hair falling against her neck. The smell of her perfume, the one I knew, the one I'd complimented 100 times, heavier in that room than it should have been. And then my own reflection in the mirror behind them, a woman in white, standing in a doorway, holding nothing. Deshawn saw me first. I watched it happen. The way his eyes caught the movement in the mirror, the way his body went rigid, the way his mouth opened. He said my name like it was a question. Renee? Like he wasn't sure I was real, like maybe if he said it with enough uncertainty, the moment would be negotiable. Tanya turned. The color left her face so fast it was like watching a light switch off. Neither of them spoke again. I walked into the room. No rushing, no hesitation. I crossed to the vanity, located the brooch beside the base of the mirror where I'd set it that morning, and I pinned it to my neckline. My hands did not shake. I set the clasp, pressed it flat, and smoothed the fabric around it the way my mother used to do when I was 9. Then I looked at them. One long, level look. Deshawn, still frozen by the chair. Tanya, one hand now gripping her own dress strap, staring at me like she was waiting for the explosion. It didn't come. I said, I need both of you downstairs in 10 minutes. Then I turned and walked out. I walked to the end of the hallway and stopped at the window. The parking lot stretched out below me, full of cars I recognized, cousins, co-workers, church families, people who had driven distances to watch me get married. The October maples at the edge of the lot had gone deep red overnight, the kind of red that only lasts about a week before the leaves let go. I stood there and looked at them. I gave myself 90 seconds. I counted them out, one at a time, in my head. Then I called Aunt Loretta, my mother's sister, my front pew anchor, the woman who had pressed my corsage for prom and held my hand at my mother's funeral and never once told me what to do with my life unless I asked. 3 sentences. I told her where I was. I told her what I'd found. I told her the ceremony was not happening. She didn't ask a single question. She said, "What do you need me to do?" I told her to stay in her seat and wait for my signal. She said, "I'm here." That was the whole call. The second call went to voicemail. My attorney, the woman I'd hired 2 years back to review a real estate contract. I kept it brief. "It's Renee Calloway. I need you to call me Monday morning. It's personal. I'll explain everything then." I ended it. Slid the phone back into the small pocket sewn into my gown. Tanya's suggestion, so I'd have it on me during the reception. I noted that detail and set it aside. I went back downstairs. Bria was in the hallway outside the bridal holding room, flower girl in tow, looking mildly frantic. I told her there was a vendor issue, something with the sound system, and that we were pushing the ceremony back 15 minutes. I said it the way I say everything at work when there's a problem I've already started solving. Flat, calm, like it was a scheduling adjustment and nothing more. She believed me. She went to find the coordinator. I went into the holding room and closed the door. The settee, the standing mirror, the single white rose in its bud vase, still fresh, still perfect. I sat down and picked up a ceremony program from the small stack someone had left on the table. It was cream-colored, printed in the font Tanya and I had chosen together. A clean serif, elegant, nothing fussy. I turned it over to the blank backside. I wrote 3 things. 1. The account. 2. The box. 3. How long. I stared at the list for a moment. 3 items. 3 threads I hadn't pulled yet because I hadn't needed to. Now I needed to. I folded the program once, pressed the crease flat with my thumbnail, and tucked it into my bouquet hand. I stood up. I smoothed the front of my gown. I touched the brooch at my collarbone, my grandmother's brooch, the one my mother had pressed into my hands at 9 years old and said belonged to the woman in the family who loved the hardest. I pressed my fingertip against it once, like a check. Then I walked toward the grand hall. 120 people. That was how many were seated when I walked through those doors. I had counted the RSVPs myself, cross-referenced the final head count against the caterer's setup twice. I knew exactly how full that room was, and I felt every single seat when I walked in. The murmur went first, then the quiet. It moved across the room like something spilled, spreading fast and even until the whole hall was still. I heard someone near the back make a small sound. Surprise, confusion. I didn't look to find out. I kept my eyes forward and I walked to the microphone. Let me tell you something about a woman who's been quiet too long. She doesn't explode. She doesn't perform. She just stops pretending the thing in front of her is something other than what it is. I thanked everyone for coming. I told them the ceremony was canceled. I did not explain. I did not cry. I stood at that microphone in my white gown with my grandmother's brooch at my throat, and I said it as plainly as I've ever said anything in my life. Then I said, "The food is paid for. Please eat." I looked at Aunt Loretta, seated in the front pew, and I gave her the smallest nod I could manage. She was already rising before I finished it. I walked out of the hall, through the lobby, past the white hydrangeas and the gold ribbon on the grand staircase, out through the front doors and into the cold October air. My car was where I'd left it, 3rd row, passenger side of the lot. I got in. I set my bouquet on the seat beside me. I put the folded program on top of it. I drove home. The whole way, I didn't make a sound. The maples blurred past the windows, red and going fast, and I kept both hands on the wheel and my eyes on the road. The program sat in my hand when I parked. 3 items. Everything that came next was already written on the back of a wedding program I was never going to keep. I got home at 2:30 in the afternoon, still in the dress, still in the shoes. I sat down at my kitchen table and I didn't move for a while. Just sat there in the quiet, with my hands flat on the surface and the October light coming through the window at a slant. The apartment looked exactly the way I'd left it that morning. Coffee mug rinsed and inverted in the dish rack. The small arrangement of white tulips I'd bought myself on Thursday, still fresh on the counter. Everything in its place, patient and ordinary, waiting for a life that had just changed shape entirely. I let the quiet do what it needed to do. Then I got up. I unzipped the gown myself, slowly, methodically, the way you handle something expensive that belongs to someone you're not sure you like anymore. I laid it out across the bed and smoothed the skirt flat, not out of sentiment, but because I'm not a woman who throws things. I covered it with the garment bag, zipped it to the top, and hung it on the back of the closet door. The brooch came off last. I set it on my dresser, centered, where I could see it from the doorway. I changed into sweats. I washed my face. I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror for exactly as long as it took to recognize that I was still myself. Then I went to the kitchen and started a log on my phone. He called 11 times the first day. I documented each one, timestamp, duration of ring, call ended. I didn't answer. I wasn't ready to answer, and I've never believed in having conversations I haven't thought through first. He left 3 voicemails. I listened to all 3. They followed a pattern, confused, then wounded, then something that wanted to sound like concern but kept slipping into self-defense. I filed them away. The second day, he called 30 more times. You know what that number tells you? It doesn't tell you he was sorry. It tells you he was scared. There's a difference, and I've always known it. I answered on call number 41. He said, "Renee, listen to me. It wasn't what it looked like." I sat down slowly, my jaw locked. I waited 1 full second. Then I said, "Then what did it look like?" Silence, long enough that I could hear him breathing, long enough that I understood he had prepared an opening and nothing after it. He didn't answer. I ended the call. That evening, still day 2, just past 7, someone knocked at my door. I wasn't expecting anyone. Aunt Loretta had texted to say she was coming by tomorrow. My maid of honor had called twice, and I'd responded both times with a text that said, "I'm okay, I'll call you soon." I wasn't ready for company, but I opened the door because I've never been someone who hides. It was Philip, Tanya's younger brother, who I'd known since he was 19 and showing up to Tanya's birthday dinners in sneakers that cost more than his rent. He was 33 now, worked in IT, and the way he looked standing in my doorway told me everything before he opened his mouth. He looked like a man who had put something heavy down after carrying it too long, and wasn't sure his hands knew what to do with themselves. He said, "I should have come sooner. I know that. I'm sorry." I stepped back and let him in. He didn't sit. He stood in my living room with his hands in his jacket pockets and told me what he knew. Last spring, April, maybe into May, he had seen Deshawn's car parked outside Tanya's apartment building 3 separate times, late at night. He'd noticed it because Deshawn drove a burgundy Accord, and the complex only had street parking, so you'd see it right there under the lights. He'd assumed it was wedding coordination. He said that to himself each time. Wedding coordination. He'd believed his own explanation because the alternative was something he didn't want to be carrying. "After yesterday," he said, and stopped. He pressed his mouth flat for a moment. "After what happened at the venue, I knew what I'd been looking at, and I couldn't keep it to myself anymore." 4 months. Whatever this had been, it had been running since at least the spring. I looked at him. I could see what it had cost him to come here, the particular exhaustion of a person who has been arguing with their own conscience and finally lost. I didn't make him feel worse for the delay. I didn't have the energy for it, and it wasn't what the moment needed. I said, "Thank you for telling me." He nodded. He left. I closed the door and stood in my kitchen. I looked at the wall. I looked at the tulips on the counter still holding. I stood there and let the number settle into my chest like a stone finding the bottom. 4 months. Minimum. Then I went to the stove and made myself dinner. Rice, simple pan sauce, something green from the refrigerator. I sat at the table and I ate every bite, slowly, while the evening went dark outside the window. When I finished, I found the ceremony program where I'd left it on the counter. I unfolded it. I read the 3 items I'd written. Then I uncapped my pen and wrote a 4th line beneath them. 4 months. Minimum. I pressed the crease flat. I set it on the table where I could find it in the morning. 1 week after the wedding. I gave myself 7 days before I went back. Not because I was afraid to go, because I wanted to be ready. And ready, for me, means knowing exactly what I'm going in to do and not leaving until it's done. I drove over on a Saturday morning with a trash bag, a banker's box, and a cup of coffee I finished in the parking lot before I went inside. Deshawn had taken his toiletries, his suits, and his PlayStation. Everything else was still exactly where he'd left it, which told me something about how he'd been thinking. He'd packed like a man who expected to be invited back. I started in the bedroom, methodical, his drawer first, then the closet shelf. I wasn't angry while I worked. Anger makes you sloppy, and I couldn't afford sloppy. I moved through each room the way I moved through a difficult quarter at work, 1 section at a time, nothing skipped, nothing rushed. I got to his office last. The locked box had been in the bottom drawer of his desk since before we moved in together. dark gray metal, about the size of a shoebox, with a combination lock on the front. I had never asked him about it. I want to be honest about that. I had noticed it. You notice a locked box in a home you share. And I had filed it under his business and let it sit. That was my choice. I'm not going to dress it up as trust when part of it was that I didn't want to know badly enough to ask. I wanted to know now. I found a flathead screwdriver in the kitchen junk drawer. The lock on that box was not built for someone with patience and 20 uninterrupted minutes. It gave eventually. The mechanism popped, the lid lifted, and I set the screwdriver down on the desk. Then I looked at what 3 years of silence had been protecting. A prepaid debit card, the balance run down to almost nothing, a rubber-banded stack of receipts. 3 hotel locations I didn't recognize. One I had to look up on my phone to understand how far from home it was. Restaurant tabs for 2 people, dated across 8 months. And at the bottom, a jewelry store receipt for a gold bracelet, the kind with a small charm, priced at $312. I have never owned a gold bracelet with a charm. You know what I thought about first? Not rage, not even hurt. I thought about the Saturday last February when he'd said he needed a weekend to himself, just some space to decompress before the wedding planning got heavy. I had agreed without pushing back. I had used that weekend to deep clean the apartment and reorganize the linen closet because I wanted things to be nice when he came home. The February hotel receipt was dated that Saturday. I remembered my mother ironing my father's shirts on Sunday mornings while he slept in, the smell of hot cotton filling the whole back hallway, her doing it without complaint because that was just love, she said. That was just what love looked like. I had inherited that from her without ever questioning the cost of it. My hands went still on the receipts. I set that one aside and kept reading. Valentine's weekend. My birthday weekend. The one where he'd said work had him buried and we'd rain-check dinner. The rain check I never collected because I didn't want to add pressure. Every stretch of distance I had written off as stress or season or the ordinary friction of 2 busy people. Every absence I had explained on his behalf without being asked to. 8 months of receipts. 8 months accounted for in a locked box that I had chosen, politely, not to open. I pulled up the joint savings account on my phone. The $4,200 withdrawal from 3 weeks before the wedding was there in the statement, clean and time-stamped. I laid the receipts out on the desk in chronological order. The math was not complicated. The final cluster of charges, the last hotel stay, a dinner tab, the bracelet, totaled just under $4,000. The rest covered incidentals I didn't need to name. He had used the account we built for a honeymoon deposit, the account I had contributed to every month for 11 months, transferring from my personal checking on the first of each month without fail, because I believed in building towards something. He had spent it on someone else. In installments, in places I would never have found without a locked box and a screwdriver. I photographed every document, each receipt flat on the desk, good light, 4 photos each, front and back, close and wide. The jewelry receipt got 6. I photographed the box itself, the popped lock, the prepaid card. I photographed the bank statement with the withdrawal circled in pen. Then I stacked everything neatly inside the box, exactly as I had found it, and closed the lid. I picked up my phone and called my attorney, the woman I'd left a voicemail for on the day of the wedding. Her assistant answered. I gave my name. I confirmed Monday morning, 9 o'clock. My voice was completely level. 10 days after the wedding. She called 4 times before noon. I watched the screen light up and go dark, light up and go dark. And I let it. The 5th call came at 2:30, and I picked up. Not because I was ready, because I was done waiting for her to run out of nerve. Renee? Her voice was soft, careful, the voice she used at funerals and difficult conversations, measured, warm, practiced. I'm so glad you answered. I know you're hurting, and I need you to know that I'm hurting too. I didn't say anything. It started as nothing, she said. You have to understand that. He came to me. He was struggling, and I I was listening. That's all it was at first. He pursued me, Renee. I want you to be clear on that. This was not something I went looking for. Let me tell you something about a woman who plans events for a living. She knows how a room should feel before anyone walks into it. She builds atmosphere on purpose. So when Tanya opened with, "He came to me and I was just listening," I heard the architecture of it, the framing, the exit she'd built into the story before she even told it. I stayed quiet. He said things about your relationship that I didn't feel comfortable repeating, honestly. But since we're here, since we're finally talking, I think you deserve to know. A pause, deliberate. He felt like he couldn't reach you. He said you were so focused on work, always managing everything, always keeping score with money. He said it felt like living with a project manager, not a partner. My jaw locked. He said you made him feel small. She let that sit, waiting for me to react, I think, waiting for me to dispute it or crumble or come back swinging with something she could deflect. That's how that move works. You land the most cutting thing first and then position yourself as the reluctant messenger. I gave her nothing, so she kept going, and that was her mistake. The story started shifting around the edges. Small things first. The timeline of when it became more than listening blurred, then changed outright. The version where Deshawn had pursued her exclusively became a version where they had both been drawn toward something neither could explain. The version where she had almost ended it twice became a version where she had recognized, slowly, that there was something real there. You know what happens when a rehearsed story hits the part that wasn't rehearsed? It starts filling in the gaps with the truth. "The suite was my idea," she said finally, and her voice had shifted, less careful now, more like she needed me to understand this specific part. "I suggested it because I needed somewhere private. I was going to end it that morning, before the ceremony. I had made up my mind. I was going to tell him it was done, that I couldn't do this to you." I thought about that suite, the way she had described it to me months ago over the phone. More intimate, somewhere quiet. You'll want a moment to breathe before you walk down that aisle. I had thanked her. I had told her she thought of everything. She did think of everything. "I was going to fix it," she said. "I want you to know that. I was going to walk away and I was going to be there for you through the wedding and just carry it, because you're my person. You've always been my person." "Then what happened?" I said, my first words in 10 minutes. A beat. "It's complicated." "It's not," I said. And there it was. The moment the rehearsed version ran out completely, and what was underneath came up to fill the space. Her voice changed. The softness dropped out of it, replaced by something that had clearly been sitting just below the surface the whole time. "Maybe if you'd been more present, Renee. Maybe if you hadn't made everything about money and logistics and control, he might not have needed somewhere else to go. I'm not saying it's your fault. I'm saying you have to ask yourself some honest questions about what you were actually giving him. And then, we understand each other in ways that you and he just never quite managed." There it was. Not the messenger, not the reluctant bystander, the woman who had spent 18 months building access, the venue coordination, the private suite, the years of confidences she'd collected like currency and spent the moment she needed them. The suite wasn't where she planned to end it. It was where she'd planned to be. The whole shape of it opened up in that single shift, from "I was ending it" to "we understand each other." And I saw exactly what Tanya had built and how long she'd been building it. I let her finish. Every word. When she stopped, I waited 3 full seconds. "We're done," I said. "Don't call again." I hung up. I opened my laptop. I created a new document. I typed 4 words at the top of the page. What I know and when I knew it. Then I started typing. 3 weeks after the wedding. My attorney's office smelled like coffee and old paper, the kind of smell that means someone has been doing serious work in a room for a long time. I liked that. I sat across from her and set my folder on the desk between us, already organized. Bank statements in front, photographed receipts behind them, and Philip's written account, dated and signed, at the back. She read through it quietly. I didn't fill the silence. "The withdrawal is clean," she said finally. "Documented, provable, premarital. That's your strongest ground." She looked up. "Have you decided on annulment over divorce?" "Yes." "Then we file on financial fraud, the joint account, the unauthorized withdrawal, and the documented pattern of expenditure." She tapped the hotel receipts. "These support the fraud claim and establish the timeline. This moves." I told her to file. She asked if I wanted to pursue anything further through the proceedings, additional claims, additional exposure. I thought about it for exactly 1 second. "Just the annulment," I said. "Clean." She nodded like she respected that. Maybe she did. I wasn't doing this to make noise. I was doing it to make it over. I made the HR call that same afternoon. Not to the school directly. I knew better than that. There's a third-party documentation process most public districts maintain, a compliance intake line designed for exactly the kind of thing where someone needs to flag a discrepancy without making it personal. I'd looked it up the week before. I called it, I stated what I had, and I gave them the specific dates. Deshawn had used sick leave on 2 occasions that matched the hotel receipt dates precisely. That wasn't speculation. That was his own district's records sitting next to receipts I'd photographed in his desk drawer. I did not editorialize. I did not explain the relationship. I submitted what I had and let the institution handle what institutions handle when they find their own records don't add up. You know what I've learned about bureaucracies? They move slow, but they move thorough. Once something is in the system, it doesn't unenter. I hung up and crossed that item off my list. The call to the corporate event firm was shorter than I expected. I'd framed it as a vendor reference inquiry. Straightforward, professional, the kind of call anyone makes before renewing a significant contract. The coordinator who answered was pleasant and efficient. She asked 2 follow-up questions. I answered both honestly and briefly. I did not volunteer anything beyond what was asked. I did not dramatize. I stated facts in the same flat tone I'd been using for 3 weeks, because that tone was the most convincing thing I owned right now. The coordinator thanked me. I thanked her back. I don't know exactly what she did with what I gave her. That wasn't my business. My business was the truth, and I delivered it. The request to Councilwoman Adeze Brewer-Mills, the president of the professional women's organization Tanya and I had both belonged to for years, the woman who had been in that wedding hall and watched me walk to the microphone. I sent by email. 1 paragraph. I told her I had information relevant to the organization's vendor relationships and asked if she'd be willing to meet privately. She replied within 4 hours. "Thursday at noon works. My office." No questions, no preamble, just a time and a location. I thought about what that meant. A woman like Adeze, who had been in that room 3 weeks ago, who had watched the whole shape of that morning shift in real time. She'd been doing this work long enough to know that when a woman asks for a private meeting and frames it around the organization, she is not coming to complain. She is coming with something. Adeze had agreed immediately because she already had questions. I was simply coming to answer them. I scheduled it for the following Thursday and put my phone down. There was no urgency. I had learned in the past 3 weeks that urgency is what you feel when you're afraid of losing ground. I wasn't losing ground. Every piece was in the right place, moving at the right pace. Rushing now would only mean arriving before I was ready, and I was done arriving unprepared. I drove home with the folder on the passenger seat, made dinner, washed the dishes, sat for a while in the chair by the window where the October light had started giving way to the gray that comes before November, and I let myself be still. I thought about the 90 seconds I'd given myself in that second-floor hallway, how I'd counted them, how I'd made the calls, how every decision I'd made since had been as deliberate as that first one. Then I went to bed. I slept 8 full hours, the first time since the wedding. 5 weeks after the wedding. I got there first. That was deliberate. I ordered my coffee, chose a table near the window, not the back corner, not hidden, but positioned so I could see the door and he'd have to walk toward me across the full length of the room. Small thing, still mattered. He walked in at 10:02. I watched him scan the space, find me, and adjust his face into something that was supposed to look like relief. He'd worn his good jacket, the charcoal one he saved for parent-teacher nights and school board meetings. He wanted to look like a man worth listening to. He sat down, didn't order anything, just folded his hands on the table and looked at me the way people look at you when they've practiced sincerity in a mirror. "I'm glad you came," he said. I took a sip of my coffee. He took that as an invitation. What followed was 11 minutes of Deshaun Price being the most reasonable man in any room he's ever stood in. He said Tanya had come after him hard. She was relentless, he said, like she was reading from a document that made him sympathetic. He said he'd been weak. He used that word 3 times, like repetition would make it land softer. He said the timing was bad, the situation was complicated, that what happened between him and Tanya wasn't something he'd chosen so much as something that had happened to him. He said he still loved me. He said we'd built something real, and he didn't want to throw it away over a mistake. He said he knew I was hurting, that he understood why I was angry, but that we were grown people, and grown people find ways through things when they care enough to try. You know what the worst part of that speech was? He believed it. Every word. He'd told the story to himself so many times it had become true to him, the way a stain becomes part of the fabric if you leave it long enough. I set my phone on the table, face up, at the start of his second sentence. I started the timer without looking away from him. He noticed. He kept talking anyway because stopping would have meant acknowledging what I was doing, and acknowledging it would have broken the spell he was trying to cast. 11 minutes and 14 seconds. When he stopped, the silence was clean. I let it sit for a beat. Then I reached into my bag. I set 3 things on the table, one at a time, in a row between us. The printed bank withdrawal documentation, our joint account, the $4,200 3 weeks before the wedding. The hotel receipts, photographed and printed, dates highlighted in yellow. And the HR department's confirmation email, printed on plain white paper, acknowledging receipt of my submission and assigning it a case reference number. He looked at them the way a man looks at something he hoped had stayed buried. His jaw moved. He started to say something. I slid the annulment paperwork across the table. "I don't want an explanation," I said. "I want a signature." He stared at the papers, then at me, then at the receipts. Something moved across his face. Not guilt, not quite. More like the specific frustration of a man who'd prepared for a negotiation and arrived to find the terms had already been set. "You're being vindictive," he said. "I'm being efficient." He looked at me for a long moment. I held it without blinking. He picked up the pen. He signed where the tabs indicated. 3 places, each one a little harder than the last, like he was trying to express something through pressure on paper that he couldn't find the words for. I didn't help him find them. I collected the signed pages, put them back in the folder, and tucked it into my bag. I didn't rush it. I was methodical the way I'd been methodical about everything for the past 5 weeks. Then I picked up my coffee, stood, and walked out. I did not look back. There was nothing behind me worth turning around for. Later that same week, Adese's office was on the 4th floor of the municipal building downtown, neat, uncluttered, the kind of space that tells you the person who works there has a system and trusts it. She stood when I came in. She offered water. I declined. We sat. I opened my folder and walked her through it the same way I'd walked my attorney through it 5 weeks earlier. No performance. No visible emotion. Just the receipts, the timeline Philip had confirmed, and the specific detail about the bridal suite. How Tanya had proposed it, framed it as a gift, and used it as something else entirely. I did not ask her to do anything. I did not suggest a response or outline what I thought the right outcome was. When I finished, I said, "You deserve to know who's been handling your organization's events." Adeze was quiet for a moment. Her hands were still on the desk in front of her, not tense, just still. The quiet of a woman who processes before she speaks. Then she looked at me directly and said, "Thank you for trusting me with this." I drove home with the windows down despite the November cold, and I thought, every piece is in place. 6 weeks after the wedding, Philip called on a Tuesday. He didn't lead with small talk, that wasn't his way. He just said, "I need you to know what's being said." My hands went still on the counter. He told me Tanya had been working the rooms, quietly, systematically, the way she worked every event she'd ever coordinated, managing the atmosphere before anyone noticed it needed managing. Her version had been circulating for weeks through the mutual social circle we'd shared for years, and it was polished. Deshawn had pursued her relentlessly. She'd resisted as long as she could. Renee had always been a little cold, a little controlling with money, emotionally unavailable in ways that had slowly pushed him towards someone who actually made him feel seen. The wedding cancellation hadn't come out of nowhere. Anyone paying attention could have seen it coming. She'd even used the word inevitable. I thanked Philip. I set the phone down. You know what I felt? Not surprise. Something quieter than that. The specific recognition of a woman who had already accounted for this possibility and planned accordingly. The quarterly luncheon was on a Thursday. 42 women, the kind of room that runs on reputation the way a car runs on fuel. Most of them knew both of us. Most of them had been in some version of the social current Tanya had been running for the past 6 weeks. I'd been mostly quiet in those circles since the wedding, not absent, just still, letting her talk. I arrived early enough to choose my seat, near the front, not at the head of anything, just visible. I wore the gray dress I saved for client presentations, the one that reads as composed before I even open my mouth. Tanya came in about 10 minutes after I did. I watched her register my presence from across the room. Something flickered across her face, quick and contained, and then her social mask was back in place. She took a seat on the opposite side. She did not approach me. I did not approach her. That was fine. I hadn't come to approach her. I spent the first half of the luncheon doing what I always do in rooms full of professional women. I listened. I asked good questions. I laughed at the right moments. The woman to my left was a commercial real estate broker I'd met twice before. Sharp, observant, the kind of woman who files things away. We talked for a while about the fourth quarter. It was a real conversation. I wasn't performing. Adeze ran the program the way she always did, efficiently, with the kind of institutional warmth that made you feel like the meeting mattered, which it did. It always had. When she opened the floor for member business, 2 women spoke before Tanya did. Then Tanya stood. She was good at standing in rooms. 14 years of watching her, I knew that. She had the posture of someone who believed she still controlled the temperature. She said she was expanding her client roster for the spring season, that she had availability for galas and corporate functions and private events, and that she'd love to connect with anyone who had needs coming up. Adeze looked at her. It wasn't a long look. It didn't need to be. "Thank you, Tanya," she said, with the particular polished neutrality of a woman who has made a decision and sees no reason to announce it. "We'll keep that in mind." That was all. Let me tell you something about 42 women who have been in professional circles long enough to speak that language fluently. Not one of them needed a translation. The sentence landed exactly the way it was meant to, complete, final, and dressed in perfect courtesy. I picked up my water glass and took a slow sip. Tanya's eyes found me across the room. I held the look. 1 second, 2, 3. Then I turned to the real estate broker beside me and smiled at something she'd started to say. After the luncheon, 2 women pulled me aside near the coat room. They had questions. I could see they'd been carrying them for a while. The careful, restrained way they approached me told me they'd already heard enough to want the other side. I gave it to them plainly. No theatrics, no embellishment. I told them what I knew, when I'd confirmed it, and how. I answered both of their follow-up questions honestly and briefly. I didn't ask them to do anything with what I'd shared. I didn't need to. That evening, my attorney had sent the file by courier earlier that day. I'd left it on the kitchen table while I was at the luncheon. When I got home, I changed out of the gray dress, made myself a cup of tea, and sat down. The phone records were printed on 12 pages. Our joint carrier plan, the one I had been paying for since the 2nd year of our relationship, because it was cheaper as a family plan and it made sense at the time. I read through them methodically, the way I read everything. The contact between Deshawn and Tanya didn't begin 4 months before the wedding. It began 18 months before. 6 months before he proposed to me. I set the last page down on top of the others. I aligned the edges. I sat with it for a moment, not spiraling, just letting it settle into its real shape. Then I said it out loud, to the empty kitchen, because some things need to be spoken to become fully real. He proposed to me on a Saturday night. He called her Sunday morning. I closed the folder. I got up and made coffee. 6 months later, the yard was small. That was the first thing my realtor had apologized for, standing at the back door with her tablet and her careful smile, already preparing her defense. I told her to stop. I'd grown up in an apartment. A yard was a yard, and this one had a dogwood tree in the corner that would be something spectacular in April. I stood at the kitchen window that first morning with my coffee and watched the early light move across the grass in long, slow strips. November light, thin and honest. It didn't flatter anything. It just showed you what was there. What was there was mine. The annulment had been finalized 6 weeks before I signed the papers on the house. My attorney called me on a Wednesday afternoon, professional and precise, the way I'd come to appreciate her. I thanked her. I hung up. I sat at my desk at work for a moment, looking at nothing in particular. Then I went back to my quarterly projections, because the 4th quarter doesn't pause for your personal life, and honestly, neither did I. The promotion had come through 3 weeks after the luncheon. Regional director, 4 territories, a team I'd been informally leading for 2 years without the title to match. My director called it long overdue. I called it Tuesday. The first month's pay difference went directly toward the house. 2 bedrooms, a yard, a kitchen with a window above the sink. That was all I'd asked for. That was everything. You know what nobody tells you about starting over? It's quieter than you expect. Not empty, quiet. There's a difference. Empty echoes. Quiet settles. I painted the living room a warm terracotta that the listing agent had called bold. I called it correct. It caught the morning light in a way the old apartment's gray walls never had, and every time I walked past it in the early hours with my coffee, something in me went still, in a good way. The kind of still that isn't bracing for anything. My mother's brooch hung in a small shadow box frame on the kitchen wall, right where I could see it from the stove. I'd made that decision the week I moved in, standing in the kitchen with the box in my hand, and I'd known immediately that it was right. She'd told me it belonged to the woman in the family who loved the hardest. I'd carried it as a weight for long enough. Now I looked at it every morning while the biscuits were in the oven, and it meant something different than it used to. Something I didn't have a single word for, but didn't need one. Some things you stop wearing and start honoring. Philip called once, about 2 months in. He didn't stay on long. He told me the winter gala contract, Tanya's largest, the one she led every client pitch with, had been reassigned by Adese's organization without public comment. 2 more clients from the professional network had followed shortly after. The corporate event firm had not renewed. She'd taken a part-time position at a hotel to cover her overhead. He told me she and Deshawn were no longer together. I thanked him. I meant it. I did not verify anything he'd said. I haven't looked. Whatever was left of that story belonged to the people still living inside it, and I had stopped living inside it a long time ago. Deshawn's vice principal candidacy had been formally withdrawn after the HR review, a position he'd been building toward for 2 years. He remained in his current role under a performance improvement plan, a smaller version of the man who had believed my patience was the same thing as permission. I don't think about him often. When I do, it isn't with heat. It's with the specific clarity of someone who finally sees a thing in its correct size. Aunt Loretta's 72nd birthday dinner was on a Saturday in late October, 1 year, almost to the week, from the morning I'd stood in a white dress at a window counting 90 seconds. The table was long. The food was good. The people around it were the ones who had shown up when it mattered and stayed without being asked to. I sat near the middle and looked down the length of that table, and I felt something I hadn't had a word for until that exact moment. Uncrowded. Like I finally had room inside my own life. Like something that had been taking up space for years, something I'd been quietly arranging myself around without naming it, had simply been set down. And I hadn't noticed how heavy it was until my hands were empty. Aunt Loretta caught my eye from the other end of the table. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. She just nodded once, the way a woman nods when she has been waiting a long time to see something come right. Someone asked me recently if I regretted anything about that day. I thought about it seriously. I thought about 11 minutes of talking while I sat there timing him. I thought about pinning that brooch back onto my gown while they both stood there watching me do it. I thought about 18 months. I thought about a Sunday morning phone call. Then I looked at that brooch on my wall, right where I can see it every morning. Not a single second. Thank you for watching until the end. If this story meant something to you, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. I've got 2 stories on the screen that you have to watch next. Have a great day.